I'm 99. They zipped the bag up around me and walked away. I woke up hours later, coughing into the black cloth, the world reduced to a taste of metal and gasoline, and the tiny, ridiculous sound of my own breathing. For a long minute, I couldn't tell where my body ended and the bag began. The fabric clung to my face like a rag, cold and damp. My hands fumbled and met resistance stiff, unfamiliar weight. A voice somewhere in the dark. A boot crunching over frozen dirt. Then the cold hit me the way memory was sharp and honest, and the smell came, not the coppery scent anyone imagines after a bullet, but the thick, sweet burn of petrol and something acrid like old rubber. Far off, explosions stitched the night with light. They thought I was gone. If that sentence shocks you, stay with me for a moment. If you want more first-hand wartime stories and the history behind them, hit subscribe and stay with me. Not because I'm special, I'm not, but because someone ought to remember what men like me saw when the maps stopped making sense. The zipper stuck on the first try. My fingers worked stupidly, clumsy with cold, and with a kind of stunned relief that made me forget the small, practical things like which way the zip pulled. When the mouth of the bag opened enough for air to rush in, I could see stars of smoke and a pale winter sky. I crawled out like a child from under blankets, blinking into a landscape that still smelled of fresh fires and spilled fuel. It was mid-December 1944. The Ardennes was supposed to be quiet this time of year trees naked, the ground hard, but there was nothing peaceful about that morning. The snow had been trampled and dirt turned to frozen mud. Everything had the brittle look of a thing that might break under scrutiny. Men lay in the white like mistakes. How do I explain what it feels like to be mistaken for dead? It's a small death and a large one. Small because your body is still there, because breath returns, because you can feel your toes. Large because where once you belonged to a squad, to the map of movements and orders, there was a hole. The unit moves on. The first aid men had enough to do. They stacked the bodies and stacked them again, and in the confusion of counterattacks, of medics trying to pick who could still be taken, someone judged me beyond help. I don't remember the last clear thing before that. A burst of gunfire, the hiss of something overhead, the crunch of some poor luck that put shrapnel where the medics later assumed death lived. I remember lying face down on the frozen dirt, and then the world folding. When I crawled out of that bag, I did not find the usual battlefield tableau. No smoking corpses in neat rows. There were, instead, lines rows and rows of metal cans, jerrycans standing like a forest, stacked boxes. Tanks, American tanks, parked in a way that made them look like statues, heavy, gleaming, and absurdly useless. Their turrets were turned in idle directions. No crews around them. No tracks pulling away. Some had hatches open. Others sat silent, as if the men had stepped out and decided to return in a moment that never came. I remember thinking, as clear as any child's epiphany, that the first thing I smelled wasn't blood. It was gasoline. That smell guided me like a lighthouse in fog. Later I learned the words for what I had stumbled into. A forward supply cache. A captured depot. Hansfeld, though, I didn't know that name then. I knew only that the place breathed fuel, and that the ground seemed to hum with the possibility of motion. Somewhere close, men argued in clipped tones. An officer was shouting about manifests and trucks. A German voice tense, incredulous spoke of finding tens of thousands of gallons. I wasn't fluent enough in German to catch every word, but the number stuck out even to me. 50,000. 50,000 gallons, stacked and waiting. Later still, after the war, when I sat in dim kitchens with younger men who wanted to know what the front smelled like, historians told me the facts cleanly. Hansfeld contained roughly 50,000 gallons of fuel when it was discovered by German elements. The date, December 17, 1944. For the first time, A sliver of sense slid under the chaos. They weren't just taking territory. They were trying to seize the arteries of an enemy's ability to move. Up until that winter, most of us believed war was decided by courage, by tactics, by a lucky maneuver. We trained to kill the enemy's will. We didn't train, the way the top brass had to think in gallons, in pipeline pressure, in daily sustenance for engines. I remember riffling through a soggy manifest. Someone had dropped a page stiff with cold, numbers and places, crude handwriting I could barely make sense of. I didn't know then that those lines connected to Texas refineries, to pipelines that ran beneath the sea, to truck convoys that kept a whole army moving. Later it became clear the Americans were moving fuel like a river. The Red Ball Express had become a lifeline across shattered roads. Pipelines like Pluto fed the fight almost invisibly. By winter, the Allies were pushing something like 7.5 million gallons a day to the front. 7.5 million. When you stand in front of a stack of jerrycans, the scale becomes real in a way numbers on paper never could. A single can is about a gallon, or so 10 or 12 pounds. But rows and rows, thousands of them, are a promise of motion. Tanks that can roll, trucks that can carry men and ammunition, heaters that can keep a shell of a camp from freezing to death. In the German accounting, every liter mattered. In ours, supply had become mass. You could win a battle and not be able to exploit it if the wheels beneath you were empty. The disparity was a kind of humiliation to the German soldier who came upon those piles. Hunger makes you count every bread crust. Scarcity teaches a brutal economy of survival. To watch hundreds of cans uncapped and left, sometimes destroyed by their own captors, was an acid lesson. There was an image that would be repeated in the days to come: the immobile tiger, the great German tank that could kill anything in its path, sitting with its engine cold, denied by absence of fuel. A machine meant to dominate was just a hulking corpse without oil. They were burning supplies to deny them to the enemy, too. That was another thing I saw: an American engineer, face grim, throwing a phosphorus grenade into a pile until the metal hissed and flames took hold. I didn't know his name at the time, though later I heard of men like Captain John Brewster, engineers ordered to destroy rather than surrender complex supplies that would one day be weapons in someone else's hands. The sight of a depot going up was like a sacrament awful and certain. It was more than strategy. It was the confession that winning sometimes means burning what you cannot save. At one point I crawled to the side of a road and watched black smoke roll up in a column so thick it looked like nightfall. The sound was different than gunfire, a constant hungry roar like a small animal in pain. Men in American uniforms moved among the flames, their hands white with work. A technical Sergeant Paul saw this. I was told later threw a phosphorus grenade into a stack to make sure the fires wouldn't smolder and be recovered. He was obeying orders that were brutal in a bureaucratic way. Deny the enemy fuel, deny them mobility, deny them any comfort. There is an odd moral calculus in war. The man at the front who can shoot and the man who keeps the machines running are engaged in the same act of violence. They are just different parts of the same engine. The German regimental commander Piper, the name came to me in whispers after the war, stood in the ruined light and looked at what had been taken. His face told me something I would not understand fully until years of maps and memoirs and cold historians opened it. He had been fighting a nation that could replace what was burned with another 100 shipments from across an ocean. Industry is a strange kind of soldier. That day, crawling between rows of cans, I found something else. The small human details that make history complicated. A child's toy, a photo in a mud-splattered frame, a letter with the corner chewed by water. On the one hand, you can talk about millions of gallons and truck convoys. On the other, the face of a man tucked into his helmet, dead in a pile, you might have been placed beside. The contrast between those statistics and individual grief is what a veteran remembers when he says he woke up in a body bag. I think of the Malmedy massacre, mentioned in hushed tones among the men around the fires, an atrocity that had become a touchstone of what the enemy could do at its worst. We used it as a warning, as fuel for the anger that kept us moving. I do not dwell on the event here. It sits in the mind like a stone. Mentioning it is necessary when you try to understand what hatred does to soldiers and what fear does to commanders who might think that denying supplies changes hearts. At least rhetoric on both sides hardened into a gladiatorial attitude, a willingness to burn a village, to kill a convoy, to treat prisoners poorly, because logistics turned so much on who had the last ration. There is a scene I cannot unsee, a line of American trucks' older vehicles, windows fogged with breath idling, while men between them laughed with an absurd, exhausted humor. They had cigarettes and coffee, and a kind of careless generosity towards the material that is obscene to someone who has watched his tank idle for lack of a liter of fuel. One Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman, a name I heard later attached to captured manifests, was shown a page of numbers and blinked as if offended by their scale. It takes a long time to get used to abundance. We learned then the new rule of modern battle. A brave infantry charge still mattered. A well-timed ambush could win a skirmish. But the ability to sustain, to replace, to move thousands of tons every day, that was the thing that made the difference between stall and surge. Men like me could be brave or stupid, lucky or wise, and still be mere chess pieces unless the conveyor belt of fuel and steel and food kept moving. Until that moment, in my own small life, I believed in a kind of honorable myth, that war was drama, that a few decisive moves would tilt entire fronts. The winter of '44 dissolved that myth in gasoline and fire. I watched an engine room burn to the ground because the men in charge calculated that leaving it intact would hand victory to the other side. I watched American engineers torch millions of gallons to prevent a single German division from rolling its tanks forward. That kind of calculation felt like a betrayal at the time, wasting what could have saved someone, but it was merely the arithmetic of war on an industrial scale. You learn later, if you keep your wits, how much industry matters. The Red Ball Express, that great, ragged convoy system, was a school in endurance and improvisation. Trucks ran day and night to ferry supplies from ports to the front. Men who never wanted to be drivers found themselves custodians of victory. Pluto, the pipelines under the ocean, was another layer of invisibility. A man could walk past a field and never suspect how much of the fight was being decided by something resembling plumbing. But there it was. The fuel flowed, the engines turned, and the line moved. When the Germans found an American fuel dump, their faces registered something like disbelief. There are only so many ways to feel when your supply trains are nightmares and your tanks are running on hope. One captured German officer said later, according to after-action reports I read years afterwards, that they measured. Fuel in lighters and stove-up kitchens measured it in spoons. The idea of seeing tens of thousands of gallons seemed obscene to him. That day, still half in that black bag of a memory, I crawled toward a gap in a supply line and found an American field kitchen burning. Men were feeding flames with anything that could be spared. A chaplain had his hands steaming in gloves, and someone joked of life above all beneath the smoke. Small comforts and large calculations were braided together in the strangest way. I want to be honest about what waking in that bag did to me. For years afterward, whenever I went to a reunion, or when a young man asked what the front smelled like, my mind would ping back to that moment of suffocation and release. It is a beat one single instant that rewires how you imagine your own survival. I didn't become a philosopher because of it. I became the kind of man who would notice the way supply trucks smelled different depending on what they carried, and who would keep a mind for logistics. the way others kept a mind for angles of fire. In the weeks that followed, as the Ardennes campaign churned and unspooled, we saw its oddities everywhere. Columns of abandoned German tanks, perfect in design and monstrous in their stillness, littered the roadside. Men who had been heroes became prisoners not because of a bullet, but because their fuel ran out. To this day, I can hear the clank of an out-of-fuel Tiger as if the metal were the last word in some failed promise. There is a cruelty to watching such machines die for lack of gasoline. The craftsmanlike fury poured into their armor and guns, wasted by a commodity no one thought to steward. I have talked to other survivors about that emptiness, how industrial war turns the battlefield into a ledger, and sometimes the ledger is what kills you more surely than any bullet. You survive if you can be supplied. You fail if the papers say your fuel is gone. Between the rows of cans, I found a small sheaf of orders. Ink had bled where frost had met paper, but the gist was readable. Directives to burn if capture was imminent. I kept those papers folded in my pocket for a long while. They were like a confession left behind by men who thought only a small thing of what one side called prudence and the other called waste. I never burned them. I carried them to tell the story many winters later. That night I overheard an argument I was too weak to join. A young lieutenant, thin and already tired of arguing, said they should try to move the fuel to another position. An older colonel voice like gravel snapped that they had no trucks, that the roads were choked, and that a burning depot would at least deny the enemy an easy gain. Someone mentioned Stavelot, though the pronunciation among men in the field sounded like Stavelo, another gulch where supplies had been, set alight in a decision that was both military and moral. Of the amounts burned there, men whispered that it was in the millions of gallons. Later reports put the scale of losses into that terrible number. In the moment, it was simply obliteration, black smoke blotting the morning. I wanted to see for myself. I crawled closer to the smoke and watched men in engineer uniforms place devices, light them, and watch as puddles of fuel took on a life of their own. The fire did not burn clean. It roared and spat, and the heat hit you in waves. Men turned their faces away. The sound of metal warping under extreme heat is a kind of music you never wanted to hear again. It was there, with the world burning some of the things that had kept us alive, that a thought began to dawn and refuse the small comforts of heroism. Standing between stacks of jerrycans, with my fingers numb and the zip of my coat stiff with ice, I realized that the war was no longer a contest of who was braver or more cunning. It had become, at least in part, a contest of averages. How many trucks could be kept on the road? How many gallons could be shipped? How quickly a pipeline could be repaired? The man who could keep the wheels turning mattered as much as the man who shot straight. I could feel something shift inside me, and not a conversion, but a revision. The stories in our mess tents would have to include not only heroics, but inventories. If I were to tell the truth to anyone who asked, I would have to say that the scale of American industry had turned the tide. It wasn't the only reason, of course. Morale, intelligence, weather, and the simple courage of men all braided together. But the sight of our enemies staring at fields of fuel and then looking away because their own tanks had no juice, that image burned into me. And yet, even as I say that, I must not paint the Americans as wasteful giants who burned everything with a shrug. The decision to destroy supplies to keep them from enemy hands was agonizing. Captain John Brewster and men like him did not laugh as they set fires. They followed orders that weighed the lives of thousands against the immediate need to deny the enemy. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis, who tossed phosphorus into a stack so it would burn hotter, was doing what a soldier does when logic replaces sentiment. The cost was cruel. The calculus, in its grimness, made some of our small human gestures, sharing a coffee, passing a biscuit, feel like miracles. From that vantage point in the snow, with the zip of the body bag still warm in my head, I watched a German officer, his coat too thin for the cold, stand and look at the burning depot like a man who had just seen the future and not liked it. He held papers too, and his hands trembled, not because he was cold, but because the numbers on his paper had just become meaningless in the face of flame. Piper, if that was indeed his name, folded his arms and said nothing. The silence between men can be the loudest thing on a battlefield. I want to be careful here. It would be easy to turn this into a lecture about logistics and industry. Many books will give you the clean lines, Red Ball Express, Pluto pipelines, daily tonnages. Numbers matter. But the smell of burning petrol, the way men shouted, and the way faces went slack when a tank failed to turn, that is what I keep. Facts are scaffolding. The human images are the rooms. By dawn, the pile of cans had been called. Those not burned were seized. Men who had thought themselves safe in some rough calculus of distance now had to rethink their maps. The front lines were not just drawn by trenches, but by who could move and how fast. I sat on a crate and watched as a convoy of American trucks, engines rumbling, slid past, the drivers nodding at us like we were some street of the same city. They had warmth and diesel, and someone to refill their cups. We watched them go with the mute envy of those who had learned to count every liter. There are images that never seem to leave a man. The black mouth of a burning depot, an abandoned Tiger tank, a row of jerrycans like soldiers at attention. But the first image is always the bag. The black fabric had kept me from freezing that night, even as it nearly smothered me. It had kept my body warm enough that my breath steadied, and that later, by some mercy or mistake, I found the will to crawl out and see the world again. That night, in the confusion that followed, we moved. Orders came down, not all of them clear. Men who were alive and wounded stumbled along roads with their heads down, looking for food and a truck and the particular kindness that wartime strangers give each other, a cigarette, a piece of bread, a hand to hold a muddied boot. I was lucky in a way I would not fully understand until years later. I walked away from that heap of supplies and that smoldering field. I was not captured that day. I was not killed. But part of me, an idea, an image died there. The romantic notion of war as drama had been dealt a practical, humiliating blow by the mundane genius of supply. You can have a courageous man and a brave plan, and still the tide will ride where the fuel takes it. As the days passed, my unit shuffled like men in a tired play. We saw more abandoned equipment. We saw the same rehearsed gestures again. The burning of supplies that might fall into enemy hands, the hurried burying of manifests, the tearing of names from helmets before a retreat. Each act was a small, necessary cruelty to deny the other the comfort of recycling our own wounds. And always, threaded through it all, was the knowledge that behind the lines, the factories kept working, the docks kept unloading, the pipelines creaked and pushed oil like blood. So when I say, honestly, that I woke up in a body bag and smelled gasoline first, I am not trying to be cute. That small fact folded into a larger truth. The thing that saved me that day was not solely the skill of a medic or the luck of a shell missing its mark. It was that the war had, by then, become a matter of infrastructure as much as of arms. I saw that with my own eyes among the rows of cans, and I felt it in the cold as I watched a depot burn. My hands were numb by the time I reached a road. An American sergeant, his face a map of working outdoors and cigarettes, looked at me as if I was some sort of apparition. He handed me a cup of something that tasted like coal and sugar, and for the first time since waking, I felt an ordinary urge. Warmth. We swapped names like men swap confidences. He asked my name, and where I was from, and where I'd been. I did the soldier's short accounting, no family details, no long stories, and he nodded and gave me directions to a clearing station. It was only months later, in quiet rooms with maps and interviewers, that the pattern came clearer. The discovery at Hansfeld was a fluke in the German offensive. It gave momentary hope, but the Americans could, and did, replace losses. The Red Ball Express, running hundreds of trucks day and night, kept men fed and fueled. Pluto and other pipelines carried a kind of invisible life from port to combat area. Numbers 7.5 million gallons a day, tens of thousands of gallons at a depot, became a simple way to say what the eye had already seen. Without flow, tanks are just hulks. There is a bitterness to that realization. For the man who lived and nearly died in a bag, it erases a certain kind of hero story. But it replaces it with a different kind of respect for the young driver who drove through wrecked bridges at night, for the dock worker whose fingers were numb and red, for the engineer who set fire to his own supplies so that entire divisions would not be turned against them. They are not the characters of old war songs, but they are every bit as critical. I kept going after that. The war didn't pause for reflections. Men who had been declared dead were given numbers and moved along. Men who were declared alive were given new tasks and new names in the long roster of the living. I fell into that roster like a broken cog finding a machine that still needed work. There is a humility in being a cog. You are small, but you move the rest. One more image lingers before the next move, the back of an engineer walking toward the flames with a box of devices, his shoulders hunched, his gait steady as if he were going to mass. The fire ate into the night, and in the glow, I saw the faces of men from both sides reflected for a moment in the flicker, as if the flames had drawn a map of us all. Then the engineer turned away and walked back into darkness. I do not end that day knowing everything. There are names I was given later that do not fit the faces I remember. Some maps contradict my memory. There are moments I might have embroidered in the solitude of old age. If a man tells himself a story often enough, he gives it pattern and meaning. But the bag, the gasoline, the rows of jerrycans, the smell of a depot burning, these were as real as anything I have tried to forget. And even now, when I close my eyes, I can see a light that was not about victory or defeat, but about calculation. Men deciding to destroy what they had to keep from being useful to someone else. It is a strange, terrible mercy, and the beginning of what I would come to call the modern truth of war: the factories win, not the bravest charge. The road ahead of that winter was long. We would move, be pushed back, hold, retreat, and push again. I would be injured again, and I would see other men misjudged as dead, and I would learn what it meant to count spoons of fuel and not just bullets. But in that first waking the zipped bag, the taste of gasoline, the smell of burning depot, something fundamental clicked. It was not a revelation of spirit, so much as an arithmetic lesson carved into flesh. I stood up, brushed snow from my coat, and started walking in the direction the trucks had gone. The smoke behind me made the world yellow and the air bitter, and somewhere in that bitter air a thought kept growing. We were not fighting the same war anymore. It was not only hand to hand, man to man. It had become plant to plant, dock to dock, pipe to pipe. If you wanted to know who would win, you had to know who could fuel the war tomorrow. I did not yet know what that would cost us, or what it would mean for the graves left in those fields. I only knew that I had been given a second small miracle, a clumsy, human one, and that the world I crawled back into had been reshaped while I slept. The rest of the winter would teach me numbers and names, and later the books would give me dates and totals. But in the cold and under the weight of that black bag, the lesson had first arrived. Logistics, not heroics alone, would decide many fates. As I trudged along the frozen road toward a field hospital, the sky was the color of old tin, and smoke stitched it with black. Somewhere ahead, an engine roared to life, and the convoy I had watched earlier rolled on, carrying men who would not know the small miracle of being zipped back into the living. I had been spared, or at least miscounted. I had been given a chance to tell the story. The chance hangs on that simple thought. How do you tell a world that survived not because bullets were cleverer, but because pipelines were? How do you make people feel the weight of a jerrycan the way I did? I would have to learn the language. I would have to keep the paper nose, numb with the manifests, and study the maps they brought to gather. For now, though, I walked. Ahead, a little way off, smoke rolled from a distant pile. Men clustered near it, their faces carved out by the orange light. I felt both relief and a small, growing dread. There are more lessons to learn. There are more fires to see. And there are questions I did not yet have the words for. So I walked toward the noise, holding the secrets of a man who had woken in a body bag and smelled gasoline first. The road curved, and the sound of men and machines swelled. Somewhere in that movement lay the next chapter, another time when I would see a depot burn. Another time when a tank would sit like a dinosaur because someone failed to feed it. But that, for now, is what I had. The cold, the light, the smell, and the dawning understanding that an entire war could be decided by how you moved what you had. The road curved and the smoke grew thicker, and the world narrowed to the sound of men and the steady, terrible chorus of an inferno. I kept my head down and walked toward it, like a man who had been given another piece of time and didn't know what to spend it on. My hands were raw where the zipper had cut them. My coat was brittle with ice. Every step felt like a debt being paid. At the edge of the burning depot, there was an aid station, a single tarp, a gasoline stove, faces rimed in soot. The American sergeant who had given me the cup of something sweet and hot earlier squinted when he saw me again. "You look like hell," he said with the blunt kindness of men who knew the truth of blunt things. He didn't ask how I ended up zipped and forgotten. What could you do with a question like that, except shrug and pass a bandage? They wrapped my arm. A medic with hands that smelled like iodine and old tobacco asked my name, and when I said it, he wrote it on a slip and tucked it into a pocket, as if names could be kept safe like that. Around us men moved like a small animal, with a big wound one seeking warmth, another carrying a crate, someone else arguing with an engineer about whether they had torches enough to finish the job. Everything was work, and work was what kept the living from turning into a pile of things to be sorted later. Later, this is a word I will use too often in telling this story later that day. One found a place to sit and listen to how other men were trying to make sense of what they'd seen. There were Germans with their coats wrapped tighter than the weather required, and Americans whose uniforms had been patched so many times they looked like quilts. Paper changed hands. Names were spoken softly and then forgotten. Someone produced a manifest, and for a moment the small paper took on the weight of a book. I had held a manifesto earlier stiff with the cold, but now I saw others. A young lieutenant with a pencil behind his ear read aloud a list of numbers. It was in English this time, supplies and destinations, crude handwriting, and stamped dates. Men who had been dealing with movement for weeks now joked darkly about how much easier fighting would be if all wars came with a clear supply ledger. There was nothing funny about it. The ledger told you who would move and who would not. In the mess of that afternoon, a name surfaced several times: Wilhelm Hoffman. He was not a name I had known in the field until someone else mentioned it like an answer. Apparently Hoffman had found manifests in the wreckage of a convoy and had read them with a look that made the others ask questions. How can they send so much? Someone asked, incredulous. Later the historians put language to that incredulity. The Americans were moving fuel in quantities that, even then, seemed obscene to men who had counted oil in lighters and not in thousands of gallons. Fax Anchor Memory, December 17, 1944, Hansfeld. 50,000 gallons. Red Ball Express running at a pace that looked improvised and miraculous. Pluto under the sea moving oil like a second tide. 7.5 million gallons a day to the front. Once a man hears those numbers, he cannot unknow them. Once you see a row of jerrycans, those numbers become a texture rather than an abstraction. You could see it in the faces of captured German men who wandered near the burning stacks, an expression that mixed hunger with a kind of private disbelief. They had been trained to believe in the power of machinery and crew and cunning. They had not been fed the arithmetic of industry, or if they had been fed it, they were too hungry to believe it true. One of the captured men, his name, he told me later through a translator, was Piper had been a regimental commander, or something like it. He stood with folded arms and looked at the stacks like a man who had discovered a lie about the world. Later I learned that Piper and others had been astonished to find massive stockpiles. They had expected scarcity and found abundance, and that mismatch shifted the mood of men at the front in a way bullets could not. The engineers we watched that day, men who would later be named in reports as Captain John Brewster and Technical. Sergeant Paul saw this mood with the sort of grim methodicalness that comes from carrying out orders you don't want to carry out. Brewster's orders were bureaucratic in the way that military cruelty can be. Record, destroy, deny. Salas, the man with the phosphorus grenades, did not smile when he threw one into a puddle of fuel. He did it because it had to be done. The metal hissed and the flames took hold, and the smell rose like a verdict. Watching them, I understood a new kind of responsibility. A soldier's judgment in the field is often simple: take that hill, hold that bridge, pull your friend out of the line of fire. An engineer's judgment is different. Weigh risk against future cost. Deny the enemy today what they might use tomorrow. The calculus can feel inhuman because it works in numbers that obliterate the small human kindnesses of the moment. A warm cup, a saved ration. That is one of the bitterest truths I carried home from the Ardennes. We moved after dusk, slipping along roads where the tracks of armored cars carved the snow into chevrons. Columns of abandoned German tanks showed up in those days like fossilized predators, majestic, deadly, and utterly impotent. One of them, I remember, was a tiger, half buried in a drift, its thick tracks caked with ice. Men sat on its flank and smoked. A boy no more than 19 tapped the turret with the butt of a rifle and said, "Beautiful, but hungry." We laughed, because what else do you do with that recognition? The capture or abandonment of those machines had psychological effects that proliferated. A tank might have meant the end of a line of infantry in other times. Here, it was a testament to a hole in the logistics chain. A machine without fuel is a promise broken. You see that, and the idea of glory in arms becomes a little threadbare. You begin to see the war as a series of pipes and schedules, and you resent yourself for being romantic enough to want it otherwise. There were stories, too, that did not sit well in the mouth. I had heard whispers of Malmedy in hushed tones, and there were other instances where vengeance reared its head. Those events belong in the archive of atrocities, solemn and necessary to remember. I do not tell them for effect. I tell them because they were part of the weather we moved in. The knowledge that men could be capable of such things sharpened the urgency to keep moving, to keep supply lines open, and to prevent moments where depravity filled an absence of order. Days became maps of small tasks. Get to the road, find fuel, keep the men warm. Once the immediate danger passed, I found myself billeted in a field hospital for a few days. My wounds were stitches and a bruise that would not age into a scar that told a clean story. I read, in the spare hours when fatigue did not make sleep irresistible, the manifests and captured paperwork that made logistics feel less like rumor. Men in uniform, some by rank, some by happenstance, explained what the Red Ball Express had become. Trucks running day and night, drivers with no leave, depots stacked to the horizon. Pluto the pipelines under the channel, felt like a story you could tell your grandchildren, improbable and technical. But when you saw the line of trucks and the men who kept them moving, it was no longer improbable. There were practical reasons why the Allies could sustain such output. Ports in Normandy had been cleared and restored. The industrial belt in America was still cranking out tanks, trucks, and the oil to feed them. The system had been stitched together like a machine given human hands. The consequence was that the Germans, for all their engineering prowess on the battlefield, were sometimes outfoxed by the sheer scale of production and movement. A line that could not be fueled could not be extended. Sometimes, late at night in cold billets, I would argue with younger officers about the importance of supply. They would nod as if they understood, but I could see the part of them that still pictured war as a series of gestures, bold attacks, sudden genius. It took a long time for men to accept that the dull, unseen logistics were decisive. History books would later be full of tactical details and heroics, and they should be, but it is the ledger entries that often decide turnout. You can wage a beautiful fight in a place with no gas pumps and lose the next day. I carried that thought with me into the years after the war. There were reunions and gatherings where men polished metals so they would shine for cameras. They wanted to tell stories of bravery, and who could blame them? But in less glamorous rooms, museums, university seminars, and small historical societies, there was a hunger for the practical truth. I was sometimes asked to talk about my experience. I would show the folded pieces of manifest paper I had kept. They were damp and frayed at the edges, and reading them aloud in a room of young historians was like watching an old actor deliver lines he'd known for years. The paper had lost none of its power. At times I felt guilty for the way my memory clung to logistics. Men had died in front of me. Comrades I'd known by sound more than face had fallen. How can you reconcile the arithmetic of gallons with the geometry of grief? You don't. You keep both in the same pocket and let them jostle until the cold makes you wonder which one is heavier. The manifests were proof of something, but they were also a cruel reminder of what industry could not claim. No pipeline could replace a single life. No convoy could make us forget the shape of a friend's face. If I had to choose a single moment that shifted my sense of the war from personal to systemic, it was standing at a crossroads, watching a small boy maybe 12 sweep glass from a road where an armored car had slithered into a ditch. He worked methodically, not with the thrum of normal life, but with the steady, resigned motion of those who have learned that cleanup is part of living. His hands were blackened. He had no uniform, just a patched coat. An American convoy rolled by with drivers who cheered at something on the radio. The contrast between the boy's small, daily labor and the scale of the engines that passed was like looking at two different eras pasted one on top of another. When the war finally wound down for me, the rationing and the scars and the odd little survival hauntings remained. The manifest papers went into a box that I kept in the attic for years. I showed them to a few historians, to a curious nephew, to a reporter once who wrote a piece that skimmed the surface. Every time I unfolded those pages, I felt the small shock of the man who had been miscounted among the dead and then rediscovered. The bag had been a literal thing. It had also been a symbol of momentary death, yes, but also of the death of a certain myth about war. Years later, when I sat across small tables from students of history, I said the things I had learned simply. Look, I would say, tapping the paper, you cannot separate the crates from the courage. One supplies the other. It is ugly, but it is true. They would look up at me as if trying to impose a clean narrative on what I had shown them. They wanted heroes. I wanted them to see drivers, dock workers, engineers, and the dull arithmetic that turned hope into movement. People sometimes ask whether I resent the men who set fires to supplies. They imagine me as some rustic philosopher, passing judgment from a comfortable chair. I do not resent them in a tidy way. Resentment presupposes a villain to be hated. There was no simple villainy in those decisions, only officers making cold calculations under pressure. Captain Brewster and Technical Sergeant Salas were performing necessary cruelties. Whether those cruelties were morally justifiable is a question I still turn over in the quiet. At the time, watching Phillips toss a phosphorus grenade as if he were emptying his pockets, I felt a rage that was almost personal. Later, understanding more, the rage was softened into a reluctant comprehension. Sometimes to prevent catastrophe, you must burn what you would kill to save. In the decades that followed, the image of a burning depot would attach itself to public memory. Photographs circulated. Analyses were written. Men recounted where they were when the fires took hold. For me, the smell of gasoline was the hinge of a lesson I had learned in the way a man learns a trade by hands and grit and cold nights. It wasn't cleverness so much as patience. Sit with the manifest, read the maps, listen to the drivers, and you will learn where the fight will first lose its teeth. I did not march in parades to celebrate logistics. There are no songs for manifest clerks and truck drivers in the same way there are for decorated infantrymen. And yet, if the story I tell now reaches someone in a different way, if a young officer who hears me remembers to count his fuel stocks and saves a dozen men because of it, then perhaps the ledger will have its own quiet, unlauded heroism. Old age has a way of clarifying what once seemed like a riot of sensations. My own memory has narrowed so that certain images are crystal and the rest is fog. The black bag is forever clear. The suffocation, the fumbling zip, the sudden rush of air, and the taste of metal and gasoline. The rows of jerrycans are clear. The burning depot is a photograph that will not fade. The names Piper, Hoffman, Brewster, Salas come and go, and then settle into who they were. Men doing different jobs in a vast machine. I have been asked if I ever felt luckier than the others, zipped up and abandoned, and yet alive. Luck is part of it, certainly. Someone deciding I was beyond help, someone else absent from the pile of corpses, some tiny misplacement of a hand can make the difference. But there was also timing. The war had been reshaped that winter by an infusion of supply that made possible the surges that followed. My survival was not only a personal fluke. It was wrapped into that larger pattern. I woke up in a body bag at the moment when logistics were asserting themselves fully on the battlefield. The small mercy of waking and the large truth of the war arrived together, and I cannot untangle them. If you ask me whether that knowledge makes death any less tragic, I will tell you no. The ledger does not comfort the one who loses a brother, and industry cannot warm a mother's hands. But the ledger explains why whole divisions stalled and why some men lived to tell these stories. It explains how, on a certain bleak day in December, a stack of steel cans was more decisive than a volley of rifles. There is a responsibility that comes with being one of the few who remembered both the immediate and the systemic. We owe the future a two-part memory, the face of loss and the contours of the machine that sometimes decides loss. Memory that is only one half of that equation is a kind of neglect. We must teach the romance of courage, yes, because human stories need arcs. But we must also teach the arithmetic of supply, because without it, the arcs mislead us. I carried those papers for years. I showed them in dim rooms. I told the story with the same opening line until men wanted to close their eyes. I'm 99. They zipped the bag up around me and walked away. I woke up hours later. Sometimes when the room was quiet and I saw understanding dawn in the faces of my listeners, I thought I had repaid a little of what I'd been given. The chance to speak, the chance to mark that fact in someone else's mind. Now, at the end of my days, when I think of that cold morning and the smell that woke me, I see both things at once, the bag and the manifest, the small man and the great conveyor belt. The two images press against each other like outdated maps overlaying a new one. They make a person more careful in what he tells the living. There is no neat moral to extract and hand out like candy. There is only the obligation to remember in full, of bodies and barrels, of bravery and bureaucracy. And so I tell you this not because I crave attention, or because I think my story singular. I tell it because someone ought to know that a body bed can become a doorway, a literal, uncomfortable way back into a world that had reshaped itself while you slept. I tell it because I want the next generation to understand that war's victors are often those who can keep the lights on, the pipes flowing, the trucks turning. If this touched you, if you know someone whose family sat at kitchen tables and kept secrets like mine, or if you are curious to hear more first-hand memories that blend the human with the logistical, share this story with them. And if you want to hear more survivor accounts and the histories behind them, subscribe and come back. There are more stories, and they deserve to be heard.